Well, good day, Mr. and Ms. GSA from border to border and coast to coast. Welcome to today's GSA Reverse Industry Training Extravaganza. Numero dos. We are so honored and pleased to have you join us today, and not just here in this august chamber in the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the U.S. General Services Administration, but around the world, for we are being broadcast across the greater GSA broadcasting system. And you know what that means. If it's 9 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., it's 8 a.m. in the Central Time Zone, 7 a.m. in the Mountain, 6 a.m. in the Pacific Time Zone, 5 o'clock in Alaska, and 4 o'clock in the morning for our good friends in the Aloha State of Hawaii, who are still recuperating from that President's Day blowout luau you've all been reading about in the Washington Post, I am sure. And I think it's 11 p.m. in Pyeongchang, South Korea, so we shouldn't be conflicting with any Olympic events. So again, we are so glad to have your complete and undivided attention. Now, to continue with our program, if I may, allow me to introduce the intrepid producer of these proceedings, GSA's Procurement Ombudsman, Ms. Melissa Gary.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Here we are again, second time around. I would just like to thank everybody who helped to make this possible. I'm not going to call any names because they're too numerous, but you know who you are. And I just want to say a hearty thank you. We have a great program lined up for you today. Sure you'll be happy with it. One thing I'd like to request, you guys in the back, move on up. Okay, let's get cozy. Okay? Thank you.
We were joking about that before. It's almost like church. You need to put the bands on the seats in the back to force you to come up closer to the altar and everything. Well, again, now to continue on, today's session is very much built around GSA's Federal Acquisition Service, so it is good, right, and appropriate to hear from the individual who oversees the delivery of more than $50 billion in services, products, and solutions that save taxpayer dollars and enable federal agencies to meet their missions more effectively. Please welcome, if you will, the Commissioner of the U.S. General Services Administration's Federal Acquisition Service, Mr. Alan B. Thomas, Jr.
Thanks, John. John, normally you hear, people have a face for radio, right? But John, I think, has a face for TV and a voice for radio, right? So that's an impressive combination. So good morning. I said to someone as we were getting warmed up here, it's ambitious to plan an event like this Tuesday, 9 a.m. after a 3-day weekend. But hopefully all you folks out there in internet land are awake and ready to listen and participate today. So a couple things. As Melissa said, this is the second year GSA is doing this. It was my notes said it was wildly popular last year. I confirmed that with a few independent voices. And we're actually doing 2 this year. So there's one sort of focused on the Federal Acquisition Service, and then one, I think, is it in April 10th? April 10th, focused on the Public Building Service. So if any of you watched the testimony last week on the Hill, you'll know there's some interesting things going on in PBS. I happen to have a front row seat for that, and my colleague Dan Matthews was an hour and a half for Dan of grilling, and I think I spoke for about 30 seconds. So my time's coming, I'm sure. So a couple things about the industry day. One, I just want to say thanks to all the folks from industry who are here participating, giving of your time. This is important, right? If you're in the government, you're creating RFPs, you're working on acquisition strategies, it's really important to know what industry's thinking. If you want to create a good competition, if you want to be transparent, or you want to sort of get the right outcomes for the requirements that you're shaping, it's really important to know how the folks who are responding to those requirements think and act, and how they make decisions. So you're going to hear from 3 different panels over the course of the day today to get a sense for that. So I know there's a panel on barriers to start with. There's a bid and teaming panel in the middle of the day, which from my perspective, having been out in industry for a pretty long time, is sort of where all the action happens. Industry spends a lot of time thinking about what to bid on, why they're bidding on it, and what sort of resources to commit to it. And really, at the end of the day, folks in industry are just looking for certainty. So if you've ever been on the end of a pipeline meeting where you're getting grilled about the quality of the opportunity in your pipeline, the person who's grilling you is usually just looking for some certainty because they're essentially making a bet for where to commit resources in their firm. So it'll be great to hear from industry to get a sense for sort of how they go through that process. There's an old joke also, at least that I've been part of, which is every meeting in industry eventually turns into a pipeline meeting, right? So I don't know if the panel in the middle of the day will confirm that or not. And then there's a panel at the end of the day on post-award modifications. So again, thanks to you all for participating. Lisa, thanks to you and your staff for pulling this together. Right, these kind of events are important. GSA really goes out of our way to communicate with industry to try and be transparent. So in addition to events like this, we hold traditional industry days. We put out draft RFIs. We have a website called Interact where we post a lot of information. We do one-on-one sessions. I know when I was on the industry side, I participated in some of the Alliant 2 one-on-one sessions. And those are great from an industry perspective, right? I mean, they really do foster an environment where folks in industry feel like they're being listened to. And we saw on Alliant 2, for example, you saw the requirements change to some extent based on some feedback that GSA got from industry, which is heartening, and I think it really increases the competitive pool. So again, hope everybody has a great day. Take lots of notes, ask lots of questions. Don't let these industry folks off the hook, right? So if you got something you want to know about, now's your chance when they're up in front of the bright lights to get your question asked and hopefully answered. So again, thank you and have a great day.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, sir. And we are off. I believe we would all acknowledge that the bulk of innovation in the U.S. comes from industry. Whatever it may be, products or services, the greatest advances have come in the private sector. We in the federal government need that creativity. And if we want to procure that kind of innovation and creativity for GSA, we need to welcome our industry partners with clarity and consistency, increasing understanding, promoting collaboration, and building trust in our acquisition processes. So let's listen to our guests discuss their considerations when doing business with the federal government and with GSA in particular. Now, I say listen, but you are also welcome to interact. In fact, we demand it. You'll notice that we have no microphones really here for our studio audience. That is because in this training session, we want you to use your information and communication technology devices, which I'm sure are Section 508 compliant. Now, turn the volume down, put it on vibrate, but if you see or hear anything that sparks a question in your mind, we'd like you to email it to reverseindustrytraining@gsa.gov. That's reverseindustrytraining, all one word, at gsa.gov. And we'll pass this information to our moderators who will weave these questions into their discussions. And for those questions that do not get answered within the session itself, we're going to compile a question and answer document and post that along with the recording of this event. And with that, barriers to entry, doing business with the federal marketplace. Have you ever seen, or do you recall a TV show called Most Extreme Elimination Challenge? For those of you that are not familiar with it, it was an early 2000 TV show on Spike TV, but it was based on a 1980s Japanese game show called Takeshi's Castle. And I'm pretty sure that the main thing for it was to inflict maximum contusions and concussions on the participants. Because aside from dubbing English over the Japanese dialogue, which is hilarious in itself, The contestants were just put through some of the most brutal obstacle courses. One of my, I don't know if I could call it favorite, it makes me giggle a little bit. It's when you come to that panel and you've got to choose the right doorway. You bust through one, you realize it's made of paper. No problem, you go on to the next thing. You hit the wrong one, it's solid plywood, it knocks you back into last week. Like I said, kind of makes me giggle. But it's no giggling matter if we give our industry partners concussions. We don't want to do that. So let's heed our panel members' words as they discuss the challenges with the application processes and past performance requirements, how the type of vehicle, set-asides, NAICS, and SINs impact their decision-making on whether or not to pursue working with GSA. Now, to lead our panel, please welcome a man that I'm fairly sure you're familiar with, Jim Williams of Schambach and Williams Consulting.
Thank you, John. I believe you should be announcing the next Olympics. That was fantastic. And I want to say thank you to GSA for having this Reverse Industry Day, to Melissa, Jeff Kosis, for Alan Thomas for welcoming us here today. We have a great panel for you, starting off talking about the challenges to entry and doing business with GSA and the federal government. And I'm very proud to welcome our panel. Please come up, and I'll introduce them. First to my right is Tom Romeo. He's the president and CEO of Maximus Federal, a large business. Next, Mark Heumann, vice president with ICF, a large business. Next, we have Lynn Ann Casey, the founder, president, and CEO of Arc Auspicio, a medium-sized business. And last, Andrea Marsh of Acquisition Research and Logistics, Inc., a VP of Business Development for a small business. And I want to let them also tell you a little bit about themselves and let you understand where they're coming from. So let me start with Tom, please.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I don't have the microphone. Hopefully you can hear me in the back. Yes. Okay, that's better. As Jim said, my name's Tom Romeo. I'm the president and general manager of Maximus Federal. We're a large company. We have an IT 70 PSS schedule and just made the Alliant 2 list as well.
Hi, I'm Mark Heumann with ICF. I run our GWAC and IDIQ program management office. We're a large business on the services and IT side, and we hold the IT 70 and PSS schedules, as well as HRSS, the energy management part of the facility schedule, and Alliance 2, Oasis, and HCATS.
This is Lynn Ann Casey with Arc Auspicio. We focus primarily on the Department of Homeland Security. We've got an IT 70 schedule. We just got our third renewal for our PSS schedule, and we're also a prime on GSA HCATS GWAC.
Hi, good morning. My name is Andrea Marsh. I work with Acquisition Research and Logistics, Inc., which is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business. We have a PSS schedule. We are also predominantly working in Department of Homeland Security and the Department of the Navy.
Well, thank you all. And before we get started, I also want to say thank you. Besides GSA, I want to thank the two associations who have really put a lot into this and helping us get ready. Two key leaders, Krista Sweet from the Homeland Security and Defense Business Council, Bradley Saul from the Professional Services Council. Thank you for all the work that you've done. Talking about the barriers to entry, let us start with what it takes, the resources involved in getting on a schedule. And I want to start with the small business. Andrea, can you tell us from your small company's perspective about the resources and effort involved in pursuing a schedule?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously companies are not all built and staffed alike. Small businesses, medium, large. The small business has the additional challenge of we just don't have as many people or as much funding to be able to put toward going after schedules, task orders, RFIs. All of these things cost a lot of money. Going after a major schedule or a GWAC, it takes probably a good 18 months for companies, large and small, to be preparing and making sure that they have all of their ducks in a row, have all of the requirements set, and able to bid. And for a small company that maybe doesn't have a proposal shop, that might cost us about $25,000 to pay to outsource some proposal and business intelligence sources. And that's a lot of money for a company of a small size. We have 30 employees, most of whom work on government sites. So we really need to outsource that. And of course, we have to balance that with responding to RFIs and task orders on other contracts that we might be on from a component or a government agency. So I think a lot of that resource is something we need to kind of figure out. And so when we're looking at the various major acquisitions and IDIQs, that's really that resource is one that we have to balance. We can't bid on 10 different major schedules out there. We need to kind of really think about which one is going to produce the most ROI for us and that manpower in order for us to manage those once they come through. So I think that financial resource along with the manpower and the time that it takes is something that we have to, all of the companies, large and small, have to take that into consideration. It's just different for us. We have a lot. We often have to do the same amount as the larger companies, just with a smaller staff and smaller resources. I saw a draft RFP or a draft solicitation coming out soon from a large agency, and in addition to a full proposal, they wanted a video. That video would probably add this was one that was focused more toward large businesses, but just as a reference, that video would probably add about $100,000 to that company's bid and proposal for that one effort, because it was a full proposal and a video. That's a lot of resources for companies to be putting together to make sure that we're answering the mail with the technology responses and the program responses. So it's just something that we all have to think about.
Well, Andrea, thanks. And as we all know, 80% of the schedule holders are small business. So I think it is important to pay attention to what you're doing that can change things to help small business continue to get on schedule and do business with the federal government. But from my experience, all companies struggle with getting on schedule. And Tom, if you could talk to us from a large company perspective about the resources involved, and you've recently been through this in pursuing a schedule.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So large company decisions on pursuing schedules are very similar to the comments Andrea made about small businesses and how we make those decisions. As a matter of fact, we often hire the same consultants that the small businesses hire because of their depth of knowledge on how to get on the schedules. Also, while we have a bigger team, we have to decide how to utilize those resources. So the same team that would be pursuing the schedule are responding to RFIs and helping us to pursue other opportunities. So for our team at Maximus in the federal business, we have about 10 people on our business development capture team. And just to give you some perspective, they'll respond to 50 RFIs this year and pursue at least that many opportunities. So when you think about 10 people's time and effort, it gets spread pretty thin pretty quickly. So scheduling or focusing their time becomes a critical piece of deciding which schedules to pursue and which opportunities to pursue. The schedule also requires some maintenance and upkeep, and that plays into the decision on whether we should pursue them or not. Some things seem to work very well at GSA, some things not so well, and I'll give you some examples of some of the experiences we've had. The result, we as a company, a large company, acquired a small business about 2 years ago. That small business was actually a combination of about 10 small businesses that had been acquired before we acquired the one company. That left us with 4 IT-70 schedules and 3 PSS schedules. So we have to maintain and upkeep all of those schedules. So we have a full-time resource dedicated to just maintenance on the schedules. So some of the things that person deals with or that we deal with managing the schedules. So we recently changed the internal support person for our contracts and wanted to notify GSA of that change. For one schedule, that name is kept in 4 or 5 different places. So we went through a process of 4 or 5 different notifications to make the change of our point of contact. Now multiply that times the 4 IT70 schedules we have and the 3 PSS schedules. That means we're taking 20, 25 steps just to try to get a point of contact changed. Another situation we had is we wanted to combine the IT70 schedules. It doesn't make sense for us to have 4 schedules, but there are contracts under each of those, and there are LCATs under each of those. So we approached GSA with the idea of combining the schedules. The first contracting officer we worked with said, yeah, that's a good idea, and they would support the change. They told us that the LCATs were already deemed fair and reasonable, and we didn't need to go through the process of coming up with documentation to justify that. So we started working on the modification to make that change. And then one of the other contracting officers for one of the other IT70 schedules got involved and said absolutely not, that wasn't an acceptable approach, and we shut it down. Now, I can understand actually either side of that argument, but it cost us time and money to start down the path and then reverse the path. So just consistency of messaging in the decision process means a lot to the effort and time that we have to put into the schedules. On the positive side, we've had several contracted assistant visits, and the resource that's worked with us has been great. They're very helpful. They come in with an attitude of they're there to help us utilize the schedule and minimize the time that we have to spend in compliance, and the advice they've given us has been very good. And also, when we couldn't combine the schedules, we decided to go for a new IT70 schedule under the corporate name, and we used the fast lane to do that. And the communication during that process was phenomenal. The contracting officer we worked with was happy to pick up the phone, answer any questions we had. And sometimes one of the things that I see as a frustration level for our teams is when we get in the email exchange game, because a lot of times we'll send you information and you'll send us a question back and we'll say, well, we thought we sent them all of that. We don't even understand the email, when a quick phone call would resolve that very quickly. And the Fastlane Path utilized that communication. So it was great.
Thank you, Tom. And talking about going through the process, Lynn Ann, you mentioned you have just gone through your 3rd renewal of your schedule. Can you compare and contrast the first time to the 3rd time, please?
Yes, for sure. One would definitely think that the 3rd time would be easier than the first time. But as a small business that's becoming a medium-sized business and certainly is now considered other than small in our PSS schedule, we only do renewals about every 5 years, and we don't have a full-time person dedicated to schedule renewals. So we essentially have to learn the process over every 5 years. That requires a lot of resources because we do have to learn, and we have to learn what's happened in the last 5 years to make sure we are providing the right information. Now, on the positive side, we've really had some great contracting officers, and they are very willing to answer our questions and support us through the process. At the same time, we do get the requests. One particular area that we've had some challenges in is the commercial sales practices. As a company that really only works with the federal government is our most valued customer. And this always causes questions and challenges with our contracting officer as we prepare our commercial sales practices for each renewal. So that's been a little bit of a challenge. And each time we have to spend resources. When we did our first application for our PSS schedule, we did not have outside help. But we really found that by hiring outside contractors to support us, we can get our questions answered. They actually are very familiar with a lot of the GSA contracting officers, and they can help translate some of the requests that we get. We've had some good experiences with GSA on the schedules from a customer service standpoint, but I do have some suggestions. If the GSA could focus on enhanced customer support, specifically for small businesses, this might be better requests for proposal that provide more examples or samples or details up front. Perhaps a one-on-one call with your contracting officer for 15 minutes, just as you start the renewal process, to make sure that both we're preparing the right information and investing the right amount in our response, but also making sure that the contracting officer gets exactly what information they need the first time. I'd really like to also encourage the GSA contracting officers to ask for more feedback about how a renewal went, or how a proposal went. It would be really great for them to hear some of our feedback right after a renewal or right after the first award. That would really give them the opportunity to hear some patterns and hear what some of the things they can do for the next time they send out a request to a small business for a proposal. I think that would be an incredibly helpful process for them to continuously improve. At a broader level, GSA may ultimately decide to use some very general survey mechanisms to see how some renewals went. But I really think it's up to the contracting officers in communication to ask for some of that feedback and be open to that feedback.
Great suggestions, Lynn. And Mark, as a veteran of schedules from the industry side, anything you'd like to add or reinforce here?
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the chance to speak with everyone today. You know, as a longtime GSA partner, we do have someone in-house who handles our GSA interactions, so I think we're unique on the panel. We don't go outside, for support with that. That said, it is most of a full-time job, and so it is a resource commitment for us. And on that regard, on the positive side, really, we do appreciate the consolidation of the PSS schedule. That was a really great process in terms of getting there, and I think it's great for us, it's great for you, and I think it's great for the customers too, to make everything easier. So definitely really appreciate that. We have many different schedules, and they're managed by lots of COs in lots of different regions. And sometimes we will work with one region on getting something done, and we figure out, okay, here's the process, where we're told here's what's allowable, and here's how we're going to do it. And then the same thing comes up on another schedule in a different region, and sometimes we hear, well, here's different guidance, and here's what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so we do sometimes find that we are getting kind of, at least from our perception, different policy and guidance from different COs in different regions, and that makes it a bit hard for us to plan and kind of how we're going to operate. And so it would help us a lot if there were a little bit more policy consistency, I think, across the regions and across the COs.
Well, thanks, Mark. And we know we have a third panel coming up that's going to be talking about compliance, but our panel is about the barriers to entry and doing business with GSA. I want to turn to Andrea next and talk about ROI and talk about the value of the win, explain the importance of ROI and the factors that go into it. And Andrea, if you don't mind, we also have a question which I think maybe you might be able to think about while you're asking. And the question is, has your company had any challenges obtaining government approval to partner with large businesses on opportunities? What about teaming opportunities, CTA versus subcontracting plans? And I know you're a small business, so subcontracting plans doesn't impact you. But if you have anything on teaming, I think the audience would like to hear.
Okay, yeah, certainly. I'll talk about ROI first, and then talk about some of that teaming. That's certainly something that all large and small companies do on a regular basis. As I mentioned before, and was noted initially, we all have finite, large and small companies all have sort of finite budgets for bid and proposal. So when we're looking at the schedules, we really want to see, our opportunities for us to bid on going to come out under that schedule. And particularly for a small company, or as I said, we can't either afford to nor manage, we can have a few schedules and IDIQs to manage, but we can't have, tens of them to do that. We need to think about which ones are closest to the mission areas that we support, and really servicing the government agencies, and how many task orders, what are the funding streams looking like? And, it costs money for us to put an RFI response together. It costs money for us to put RFP task order responses together. So we really need to sort of say, well, which schedule looks like we're going to be able to bid on work with our main client set in our mission space. I'm sure lots of people hear about there's so many RFIs and not enough RFPs. One of the things that can be frustrating is, say GSA or another IDQ does a fabulous job vetting everybody and getting us on a schedule, and then the RFIs oddly ask us almost exactly the same thing. And if they just trusted in the vetting of that initial set of winning companies, you could go straight to an RFP. And so looking at some of the patterns, the buying patterns that our clients have through the schedule is something that we need to look at to decide which schedule we think is going to be the most valuable for us. And so one of the things that that we look for is, well, what in a particular schedule, what kind of marketing is GSA doing with the clients that we most want to be doing work with, to making sure that those because if those relationships and that communication is good, then it's likely going to translate into task orders and work for us. And because I think that, again, with like any communication in life, the more open and the more frequent that communication is, in this case, in both with industry, with government client, and with schedule management, I think that would be really very helpful for everybody to make sure that we can do that. Certainly, the teaming is something that we all do. We do it on individual task orders. We do it on major acquisitions. Small businesses, in my case, we're an SDVOSB. Obviously, on large acquisitions, we're somebody large companies go to make sure that those subcontracting plans are in place. But also on contracts that we manage, we need to also work with large businesses. And that's something that we think about really on a daily basis, both for small task orders, which company makes the most sense. We try and develop strategic relationships with a few larges, a few other smalls, to make sure that we have sort of go-to relationships in what sometimes we call the over-under, in terms of like, okay, well, if this comes out as a small business prime, we'll prime it, you can sub to us, or we'll flip that if it comes out as a large business. Industry spends a lot of time and a lot of money, therefore, to make sure that we are putting the right teams together for the right client solutions. And so I'm not sure if that entirely addresses the question that was asked, but certainly that teaming aspect is one that I'm sure the other panelists would agree is something we all
Well,
work with
no,
on a
Andrew, that
regular
was great.
basis.
And thank you. Other panelists, if you want to address that teaming question, please feel free to. But you talked about marketing. I'd like to talk to Tom. Can you tell us, from your perspective, the importance of marketing with regard to the schedules?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So as I mentioned earlier, we're forced every day to decide how to apply our resources and which opportunities to pursue. It's disappointing if you pick an opportunity to pursue or a schedule to pursue and then don't see opportunities come through that schedule. So, from a contract holder perspective, it's very helpful if you share with us who you're marketing that schedule to, which agencies. So Maximus does business with most federal civilian agencies, and what their reaction is, especially even on specific opportunities. If you've been talking to them about potentially using this schedule, it's very helpful for us to know that, because we can support you with the customer. We usually have pretty deep relationships with them. And if we know that they're receptive to it, it's very helpful. So we hold a CIO SB3 contract as well, and they're very aggressive at marketing their schedule to the agencies. They share their pipeline with us monthly. They tell us who they've been talking to in the agencies and what the reaction has been to their discussions. And that really helps us to understand the receptivity that we're going to get when we go into that customer and suggest the use of that vehicle. So that communication is very, very helpful to us. I mentioned that it's frustrating to get on a schedule and not see the use of it. So we recently spent the time to qualify for the health SIN under IT 70, and we've been disappointed with the number of task orders that have come out under it. I think there's only been less than a dozen task orders. We do a lot of work in the health area, in the federal civilian space, and those are the kind of disappointments that make you think later, well, should we have spent the time and effort to go qualify for the SIN?
Well, thanks, Tom. And I think that is a very important point that Andrea and Tom are making, talking about marketing. I don't know how many people here or in the virtual audience are part of the Customer Account Stakeholder Engagement Organization, but I think everyone should be asking, are we appropriately marketing the schedules? And as I said before, it seems like GWACs seem to get a lot more attention. And I'm a believer in the schedules. Many of these panel members are also GWAC holders, but I will tell you they've devoted their lives to serving the federal government and the resources of their company. And they do need to look at that ROI. And I think understanding the marketing is very, very important. And talking about that, Lynn-Ann, also looking at the best-in-class vehicles and the consolidation of schedules, can you address your comments in that area, please?
Sure. With the return on investment, certainly the consolidation of schedules definitely helps. We're currently going through a process right now where we're considering adding the SINs for AIM, so the advertising and marketing, to our 00 core PSS schedule. And so we're going through that ROI, and as we go through that, we're going to be looking at what the additional requirements are. If we have to do a whole new set of rates and a whole new thing, then it's really not going to be good return on investment. We're also looking at who buys from that schedule to determine how often it's used and whether the customers that we tend to work with really are on that schedule. And we're in the middle of that analysis process now, so I figured I would share that with you. We are thinking it might be a good investment, but we are wondering what advertising, what marketing you guys are doing on these types of SINs to our customers. And if there were a place in GSA that we could actually inquire on that and find out, it would be really helpful for us to make that decision about whether or not we go for that. Certainly, the value of schedules as compared to the GWACs and best in class is a question that we have right now. It seems like GSA is, at least in what their outreach is very focused on the GWACs at the moment. And so the ROI for the schedules is becoming less clear as you see so much advertising and outreach about Alliant 2, about HCATS, about Oasis. And we see, so we're questioning whether or not, continuing to invest in schedules really makes a lot of sense. And it's definitely a question that we have. We would really, though, love GSA to continue investing in schedules because GWACs aren't for every company. While we do have an HCATS vehicle, interestingly, in the last 6 months, we've seen at least 5 or 6 opportunities that we would have bid on had it come out under HCATS, but instead they're going to Oasis. And they're human capital opportunities, but Oasis has a lower fee structure. And so that's even more confusing as well. So those are just some examples. We are hoping that GSA continues to invest in marketing the schedules to its agencies. We've also seen a really big increase in blanket purchase agreements and the use of blanket purchase agreements in the agencies that we work in. We're finding our customers, especially in the Department of Homeland Security, absolutely love the flexibility of the blanket purchase agreement and how quickly they can do task orders off of these BPAs. And that's a significant opportunity, a significant opportunity for GSA and for industry to continue to have some of these blanket purchase agreements that are really focused on some of the specialty areas. So I would encourage marketing of schedules. I think the consolidation is great, and I would also say BPAs are one differentiator that the schedules can provide to GSA and to the customers that are very excited about them.
It's a great suggestions, Lynn Ann. And talking about one of the trends being increased use of BPA is a good thing. There's another trend is new SINs. And Mark, can you talk about the challenges involved in the creation of new SINs?
Yeah, and specifically, looking at the return on investment and how industry makes decisions. I know GSA has been very active in creating new SINs, whether it's health IT or cybersecurity or identity management. I know there are others, and I think that's great. You always got to be out there responding to the market. But a new SIN is a new product. It's an experiment, and like any other new product, whether it's industry creating a software system or a new brand of cereal out there somewhere, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. It's an experiment, and you try to make it as successful as you can. And I think the added challenge for GSA and these new products is that you need industry behind you. When you roll out a new SIN, you need a good, stable of vendors to attract customers. So I want to support you in that. We all want to support GSA in making these successful. But as we talk about them internally, the question always comes up. Who's going to use it? How much are they going to use it? Are our customers going to use it? And then if we don't get sales in 2 years, are we going to get kicked off? And that last question is kind of a tough one, because even if a new SIN takes off, it might take off like the health IT. Maybe it takes off in the San Diego and San Antonio military health centers, but less, in other agencies like CDC or NIH. So I think I'm going to ask you, help me help you, help industry get on the new SINs. If we knew that there were a 5-year runway for us, if you help GSA launch a new SIN, be part of that first wave of vendors getting on it. If we had the confidence we'd have a 5-year runway to be able to stay on that and take the time to develop it over time and work new customers in over time, that would help us a lot in terms of making that case and getting on the new SINs and supporting you in the new product launches.
Well, thanks, Mark, and that's a great suggestion, increasing that runway for new SINs from 2 years to 5 years, and I hope GSA will consider it. I want to talk about compliance issues. Again, we don't want to step on the toes of the third panel, but those compliance issues go into that ROI decision. Before I do that, I also want to say we do have some questions from out there. One of the ones, and I want you all to think about it, and I'll read the teaming question again. Has your company had any challenges obtaining government approval to partner with large businesses on opportunities? What about teaming opportunities, again, CTA versus subcontracting plans? And if anybody wants to add to that, your comments, please do. Here's a question I love. Do you think you can adequately compete for RFPs that are lowest price technically acceptable? LPTA. Before the panel answers that question, I'd like to give you my answer. I think LPTAs, there ought to be a law against them in services contracts, because essentially you're commoditizing people. You're telling your customers that you can get the solution you want, and you're converting it to LPTA is a giant mistake. Now, again, this is my opinion, but it's from a few years in government, a few years on the outside. But let me go to some of these compliance issues, and feel free to comment on the LPTA issue. You have an open mic for this now. On the compliance issues, Lynn Ann, can you talk about how these compliance issues serve as a barrier to entry or affect your desire to renew on a schedule?
Sure. To your question on the teaming, we have not had any trouble getting CTAs or approval for large business subcontractors at all from GSA. So just a very positive shout out. We did our first CTA this year and no problems at all, and it's really working well for our customer as well. On the compliance issues, again, not to take away from the third panel, but compliance on the vehicles does go into the initial decision and the barrier to decide whether or not to go after a schedule. The contractor assistance visits, as we were preparing for the panel, I literally got a contractor assistance visit request across my desk in the past week, and it was a one-page letter, and it asked for a generic list of things, invoices, like for the last 5 years, for which contracts. That's a lot of work. We outsource as a small business our accounting system, And so to pull all of those invoices is a lot of work. So we just need to know which invoices and how much we have to do. I was excited, though, that the contractor assistance visit was going to be virtual. So we're going to upload all our material to a central site. That was wonderful. That was a new surprise for me, and I was very excited about it. But I'm still looking at this and saying, what do they really want with this list of things that we have to provide? So I would say those contractor assistance visits and the work we have to do does go into a decision on whether or not we want to renew or go for new SINs. So that's just something to think about when you're planning out new SINs or the compliance. I would love to really streamline the contractor assistance visits. I don't know if it's ever possible for them to go away, but to kind of consolidate them across schedules at the same time, or to really try any way to provide better customer service or better information about what really the contracting officers are looking for. That would be very helpful to us, because those alone, for this contractor assistance visit, I have 4 internal people and my accounting people all on standby, pulling stuff prior to the meeting, attending the meeting. It'll probably cost me a couple of $1,000s just to support the contractor assistance visit. So I think I've already mentioned commercial sales practices, so we'll get a lot of questions. I would love the contractor assistance visits. I think one of the panelists mentioned that you've really had a great experience with them, and the contractor assistance representatives were in a mindset of, how can we help you? Like, how can we assist you? And I find when the representatives have that kind of customer service attitude, the visits go faster, they're more effective, and you're more able to comply with the schedules going forward. But that isn't always the case, and sometimes we do have to decode some of the acronyms and language and understand some things to try to make sure we're just complying. So I'm looking forward to the third panel and more of the discussion on compliance later on.
Well, thanks, Lynn Ann. I think those contractor assistance visits are an important area that GSA can look at, and are they really necessary in services, and how do you apply a risk management and alleviate the burden there. One of the things I think all the panel members have talked about is communication. Communication from a frequency and openness standpoint. And Mark, you certainly had, again, a lot of experience. Could you talk about the importance of communication and any suggestions you might have here?
Yeah, thank you. I think, on our end, in administering and getting on the schedules, communication is very important for us. And I think, on the GSA side, you may not always understand the pressure that's going on the individuals who you're communicating with. If we're getting on a new SIN or getting a renewal or getting a new schedule, there may be a specific procurement that we need that for, and that the company is investing in, and the timelines may be getting, make us very nervous. And so there's a lot of pressure on your counterpart in industry, the contract administrator, who's probably getting pinged every week or more than once a week. What's the latest? What's the status? Are we going to get this in time? Should we continue to invest in this procurement? Just on their behalf, I'm going to ask, if frequent updates are important, even if there's nothing new. If they can get back to their internal stakeholders and every week and say, here's the status, here's the status, here's the status, I did hear from GSA, here's what's going on, that helps that person a lot. It helps our companies, but it helps that person that you're communicating with a lot in that regard. On a couple of the questions that have popped up, on the teaming front, I did want to share that, you go around the Beltway in industry, 99% of the time when someone says the word teaming, they're talking about prime sub. So if it is a different situation, if it is a contractor teaming arrangement under the schedules, please be very clear about that in the RFPs when you issue them, because it's always a learning curve for some of the folks in the room on our side. Sometimes we're not sure when an RFP comes out. Are they talking about prime sub? Are they talking about lowercase teaming? Or is it a CTA? So that would help us a lot. And then on LPTA, I'm sure others will chime in, but it's obviously not an industry favorite for a lot of reasons that are out there, but I think, it might be sometimes used not because necessarily it's best for the solution that's procured, but best for the procurement, to get a clean procurement, a quick procurement, something that's maybe protest-proof. And I can certainly understand, pressure to do that. I think that kind of puts the cart before the horse. I mean, the main thing is get the right solution for the mission. So, if there are other ways, with GSA as a leader in acquisition, other ways to get a clean, quick, protest-proof procurement done, other than LPTA, which can have a negative effect, for the customer, I think that would be better.
Thanks, Mark. To be fair to the person who asked the question, they asked, do you think you can adequately compete on things that are LPTA? And feel free to answer that question, anybody. I think it's a wrong question. As Mark said, I don't think LPTA, particularly in services arena, does the mission any good at all when you're trying to buy a solution or trying to procure the services of people. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Sure, I'll make a comment, Jim. So, it depends a lot on how the acquisition is set up. If it's just purely, we need this many headcount for our services and it's LPTA, then as a large business, we wouldn't compete with that. It's going to be the cheapest labor that you can buy with the least overhead. So that's what you're going to get. On the other hand, if really it's about the most effective way to deliver the business process and get the outcome, that's a business that we sign up for every day. So I think the importance is let us figure out how to get to the lowest price by applying our commercial knowledge and our understanding of the marketplace, and allow us to apply techniques, methodology, and technology, and we can get to lowest price.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that too. So working for a small business with very low overhead and pretty competitive rates, we very rarely feel like we could competitively bid on an LPTA procurement. I think that, we do have engineers, we have some scientists, and just speaking to the level of service, I think that would make it very difficult for us. We've seen some LPTA procurements coming out saying they're only going to read the cheapest proposal, and if it meets the bare minimum, they're not even going to read any one of the other proposals. And we see that and we think, well, there's $10,000 down the drain, because we're probably not going to be the absolute cheapest, though we're going to be pretty inexpensive. But we're not going to spend $10,000 or $5,000 or however much it is going to be to put that response together in hopes that we might be the one that gets read. So I think that's something that we just then don't bid on them, because we don't think we will win them. Nor do we think that even if we won them, that we could then provide the services adequately. We would be, I think, underserving our government clients by giving them a really inferior product of services.
So Andre, just to make sure, perspective, you mentioned a couple of numbers. We've seen some LPTA bids come out that cost us $500,000 to bid on, not $5,000 or $10,000. So the larger the opportunity, obviously, the more money we as industry have to spend to respond to it. But the decision process would be the same, is if we don't feel we can deliver value and we feel like we're not even going to have our response read, then obviously it would be a non-starter.
I would just say again, from my perspective, using LPTA when it doesn't belong means that acquisition people are not affording themselves the opportunity to use good business judgment on behalf of the mission and the taxpayers. We do have some questions from the audience, but before we do that, I want to run through the panel and allow each of you the opportunity to make any last suggestions for improving the schedules or improving the process or the relationship with GSA. Let me start with Andrea.
I sort of repetitive, I would just say that the communication, and again, the sort of three-way communication between industry, GSA, and the components and agencies that use the schedules and vehicles, I think that's really something that is correct. And then also from a small business perspective, not all small businesses are even created equal. I've reached out to some small business liaisons. I tell them who I'm with, I tell them how long we've been in government, and then they say, you need to sign up for a NAICS code. And I think, well, if you'd read my email, you'd see that we've been in business for more than 15 years. We've figured that part out. So there are small businesses with vastly more complex work than we do, and just kind of remembering that small businesses have a unique place in all of this.
And before you go on, Lynette, let me just, as you answer this question, think about this question too. Once you have a scheduled contract, what is your role or responsibility to make it successful, and what is GSA's role? I think you all have touched upon that through the marketing, but if you think of anything else in that area, what's your role versus GSA's role in working together to make it successful?
Well, to answer that question, interestingly, I think both of our roles are marketing, but I think we do them a little bit separately. So I think our role with the schedule is to market that we have it, get it out on our website, tell our customers about it, share and focus and success stories so they know what our past performance is and that we're available on this vehicle. I think GSA's role is also marketing in a lot of sense, and it would be great when you first get a schedule or first do a renewal to have a touch point with someone in marketing to be able to, at GSA, to talk to them about how can we help you, what are your primary strategies to market to, say, this certain department that we're focused on. If we understood what your marketing messages are, we could reinforce that. We talk to the customers all the time, and so we're a channel and a voice for GSA with the customers, and we can share that. In terms of exciting ideas or any last thoughts on ideas, I have a couple. The first would be, I would love to see more either podcast or videos from GSA, especially, so now we were a small business. We're still a small business in many contracts, but we're starting to be a large business in one of our schedules. I think back to when I was a brand new small business. Getting onto a schedule was absolutely terrifying. If I could see what a contractor assistance visit was like in a video, if I could see what that first conversation was with a contracting officer so that I knew, you always hear about the negotiations that happen with GSA contracting officers. If you could demystify that process a little bit more, it would be wonderful for small businesses. So I'm advocating for the first time small businesses. But for our company, when we do the renewals, I would love to refresh and get some resources, podcasts or videos to kind of see what that is like. That would really help give us the confidence, be prepared, make sure we're giving all the information. Another suggestion I have is around sharing more success stories around your BPAs and agencies that have done BPAs. Why that's good, why you can really do incredibly fast task order procurements off of BPAs. I personally, I'm not even advocating for just single award BPAs. I like the BPAs where maybe there are three winning companies. So you still have competition within the agency, but you can have that competition, and you can know that you're going to get 2 or 3 great proposals really quickly, and you can make a decision very quickly. And in those BPA task orders, the protest likelihood is so low because there are 3 companies that are working with you for, say, a 5-year BPA. And so you get to know the companies get to know the agency and how they make decisions, and they're comfortable with whoever wins on those task orders. So those would be my recommendations and ideas on lowering the barriers to entry or encouraging more use of schedules.
Thanks, Lynn, and I think those are great suggestions, and I think looking at the BPAs for the multiple awardees and getting competition at task order level, that fits squarely in, I think, one of Administrator Murphy's key goals. So I think that's a great suggestion. Mark?
Yeah, in terms of the vendor responsibilities on making contracts and schedules successful, I spend a lot of my time helping customers navigate the options that are out there for them. They may not be as educated on all of them. So the schedules, the GWACs, the government-wide IDIQs, and the agency-specific vehicles. And what's been great over the last several years is more and more openness and recognition of the value proposition of the GSA vehicles, the schedules, and the GWACs, and maybe a little bit less focus on the agency-specific IDIQs. And so I think that's a great opportunity for us, collectively. There's really a movement there that I think we can all capitalize on. In terms of other kind of last thoughts, something you hear a little bit more about today, I think in a very interesting way, so watch for it, is about RFIs. And if you ever issue RFIs, be it at a schedule level or a task order, kind of the importance on our end of a communication after the fact. So watch for that in the next session.
I think we've touched on the communication piece quite a bit, but I can't stress the importance of pick up the phone. It shortens the cycle for everyone. It decreases the frustration level immensely. So I would just reinforce that. We've talked a lot about communications around marketing and the pipeline. Helping us to understand that will help us know which customers to approach. I think, we want to help get our customers to utilize the schedule. We invested in the schedule for a reason, so knowing where we're working on the same outcome would be very helpful. And then finally, I think you've heard a couple examples of where we as contractors felt we got inconsistency in answers from GSA. So, I would request maybe an appeals process, somewhere for us to say, look, we got this answer from one side, this answer from another side. Can we take it up a level and have just one answer? It would help us to understand a lot more about where the policy lies and what the absolute answer is.
Tom, I think that's a very important suggestion. And anywhere else in society or in government, you can appeal if you think something is just plain wrong. And I think GSA and its management should be open to that. I've certainly had, in my experience, people appeal to my boss, and I understand it. As Tom said, a lot of times they're dealing on issues where there is inconsistency, or maybe it's somebody who doesn't know all the history. And I think being able to use that appeal, not frequently, but when it's appropriate, I think would be very helpful. I think the messages on the communication, everybody's talked about. Mark just talked about the targeting and understanding where you are having success and where you're targeting with agencies. I will tell you, in talking to a senior procurement executive at a cabinet level agency, said she didn't want to use schedules, they were too rigid. Talking to another senior procurement executive, said, I want to use schedules because GWACs are too rigid. And just contradictory messages. And I think the more that this partnership between GSA and the industry can align on the communications between them and the communications together to the agency customers, the better. We do have another question here that I want to get to. GSA has many training subjects available online. Is there any suggestions you have for other training topics? And I know, Lynn Ann, you suggested the podcast on various things like the contractor assistance visits. Anything else that any of you all see in terms of training online that's not available today?
I'm going to be honest, I don't know if it's available. I haven't checked that site, but I mentioned CTAs and how confusing it is for many of us on our end because it doesn't happen as frequently. So training on there about CTAs, what they are, how they work, how you bid them, I think would be great.
Thanks. We have other questions. They have managed to disappear from my screen here, but let me go to one that I think I remember. And the question was around e-buy, and for a small business, but also for all of you all, how much do you see e-buy as a good tool for you? And Andrea, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that we've not used it at all. But at my former company, which was a large company, we did use it some. So I can't really comment on it with much authority, other than it's not something that we've looked at particularly or been able to manage.
I think there are improvements to be made, and then maybe one of the last groups might talk about that. But I think doing things through a tool versus email is great from my perspective. Email is unpredictable. Email servers go up and down. There are always issues that come up with emails, and everyone's worried, are we going to see the RFP? Has it come out yet? What about the amendments? Are we missing something? and it's all out there on a website. That makes everything much cleaner. And the same thing with proposal submissions. Submitting a proposal via email can be very stressful. File size, email glitches, you don't know. Then we're bugging you to get a confirmation, did it come through? So doing all that through a website makes that a lot cleaner.
You know, looking at where the schedules are headed, I think there's the possibility that commodity products go in a different direction, and that the schedules are really focused on services. I guess I want to ask the panel the question, looking at the current compliance issues around, and I don't want to steal the thunder, but as you look on services, things like price reduction clause, commercial sales practices, I know those are areas that are very confusing to companies, but as we go down the path of potentially schedules being all about services, are there any other suggestions you have in this area? Mark, I know you've been in this game the longest.
Nothing just jumps off right to mind. I think, just making it simpler and more consistent and easier for everybody. I think that piece of it that, is where a lot of the resources get spent, and a lot of why companies have to go outside to go spend money on getting support. So I don't know that I have the answer, but I know this could be a good area of focus to streamline.
Well, just thinking about this in terms of you're buying services, you're buying labor, and that seems like that's something that's pretty easy to check through other sources rather than going through all of this detailed information from the company. If you're proposing labor rates, it seems to me, might there not be an easier way to verify the reasonableness of these? Anybody like to comment on that? Oh, go ahead. Okay, if not, let me get to the other questions.
So, Jim, can I make a comment on
Sure.
the previous question? So one of the concerns with schedules going forward for us as a company is that services are becoming a blend of technology and people. And it makes it difficult under a schedule to blend it. So, I know the cloud work has been an example of that, but we see things like citizen services heading in the same direction where, the combination of digital technology and people answering the phone or answering questions are often required as part of a contract. And, figuring out how to address that under a schedule that's split into technology and people makes for a very difficult discussion with our customers.
Thanks. Let me go to another question. Yes?
Whenever you're done with that question.
You have a quick question from the audience?
Yes.
I'd rather take one from the audience here. Montrez?
Thank you. This question is, you've spoken a lot about RFIs. And so I want to ask you if you've encountered RFI instructions that read, you must reply to this RFI prior to or subsequent to replying to an RFP. You haven't seen any of that before?
No, I've seen the opposite. I
Okay.
usually find that it's very clear that you are not required to respond to the RFI to respond to the RFP, and I have found personally that the instructions are very clear in that direction. I though wonder if my panelists have seen something opposite.
Every once in a while, you'll see that. Must respond to the RFI in order to even get the RFP, and so I don't think that's bad. I think it's kind of a way of down select or advisor down select, whatever you want to call it. I just ask that they make those instructions very clear, bold print, run on the top. That's what the situation is.
Yeah, I would just add, I have not seen it explicit, but I have seen former company and with the Department of Defense, there were some times where it went straight from RFI people who responded to direct RFPs. The only thing I bear in mind with the RFI too is that specifically with, at least in my experience, specifically with technology companies who are providing scientists and potentially intellectual property, there are often reasons why companies do not, very specifically and deliberately do not respond to RFIs even though they have absolutely every intention of responding to the RFP. But there's certainly my former company, which was very IP heavy and technology oriented, they were very worried about their proprietary solutions being usurped and given to some other company as a response of those RFIs.
Thomas, this is a question for you. You mentioned being disappointed when, getting on a schedule and then not being able to do tasks. Do you ever check to see, is it already saturated with other vendors or industry partners already? Do you ever take the time to review that prior to? And does that have any kind of impact at all in your decision making?
We do. We always check to see who else is on the schedule and, who we think we would be competing with under those schedules. So that is always part of the decision process. In some instances, specifically the health center, we do a lot of work in defense health, and they made a commitment to leave a vehicle that they had called Teams and to move. And so we expected to see the movement of a lot of those opportunities, and it hasn't happened. So, but yes, that's a great question. It's certainly one of the aspects that we look at to make a decision on whether to put resources there.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, Montrez, to your question about RFIs, I think the panel spent a lot of talk in preparation talking about those, and I think you heard Mark say, when you respond to an RFI, and as a company, you're interested in that potential opportunity, but then there's this dead space where you hear nothing back, and you don't even know whether the government is going to respond favorably to what you put in the RFI. I think any way you can give feedback would be a good thing. I think also looking at RFIs, just recently had one come out from another agency, and they were very, very prescriptive in what they wanted. The industry was calling it a draft RFP, so why did you bother? And I think when you look at RFIs, I think you ought to look at them very judiciously. What message are you trying to send? Are you open to other ideas through the RFI? Is there something real behind this? Is there money? Is there a real requirement? And are you going to provide any feedback along the way, as opposed to putting out an RFI and waiting months before the industry hears anything back? Krista, looks like you have a question.
Yes. So as a challenge to doing business with the federal government, not just GSA, but the entire federal government, something I hear all the time from companies is the importance of being a prime. And this kind of somewhat goes to the teaming question, that companies cannot survive as only a sub for getting capital as a small business, things like that, challenges that mid-tiers have of not being an attractive teaming partner to larges because they don't get credit for it. Can you sort of comment from your perspective on the importance of being a prime or the challenges of being a sub, of how that impacts your ability to survive and your ability to do business with the federal government?
I'll take that on as a small business. I'm sure Lynn also has some thoughts on that. I would say that it's imperative to be able to get opportunities to be a prime. I'm fortunate I work for a small business that's had a number of prime contracts, in fact, multi-million-dollar prime contracts where we have managed subs. What we're seeing now is in other either DWAC or IDIQ combinations, especially those that are going to the sort of self-scoring sheets, we get major bonus points for having been a prime, and it really almost eliminates companies who haven't, because that's something that, and it's one of those things like everybody, it's like getting your first job out of college, right? Do you have the internship? Do you not? You got to get that first foot in the door, and making sure that creating opportunities for small businesses to get that prime spot is very important, because without it, you are at the mercy of everybody else. Unless you have, and this is only true for some very, very rare small companies, some very, very special, unique niche capability or technology offering that everybody really wants or is highly sought after. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too.
I mean, I think for small businesses, a natural place to start is as a sub. But we very quickly realized that the overhead costs of being a subcontractor were high, like really high. And so as we started to prime, we realized it was so much easier to work with the government than work with some of the really large subcontractors. So we have shifted our business now to where somewhere between 89 and 90% of our business is as a prime. We are, as I said, somewhere between small and large. We have about 100 employees. And we really are very careful about subcontracting to large businesses. We do it when we know the large business has a good chance of winning, and we have a long established relationship with them and a lot of trust. So we are definitely willing to be a subcontractor, but we really have to have that relationship of trust. And we're more hesitant to sub to a company we've never worked with before. So that's just our experience.
You know, as a large, long-term business, we prime and sub. You know, obviously everyone wants to prime. You know, we prime more, but we support small businesses in their bids. We team with other larges. You know, often the government's buying very complicated, large solutions that require the skills of many companies, and so sometimes that does put us in the subcontractor role, and that's part of doing business. In this field, certainly prime is preferred, but I think companies have to look at both ends of this, and particularly with these large, complex solutions, what's the best combination for the government?
Yeah, and I would agree with that as a large, but I would say that as I look over our portfolio of business, I would never want more than, say, 15 to 20% of our business to be subcontracted out. We need to continue to represent ourselves as a prime. That's where the past performance comes from. It's where you control the deliverable for the customer and you build a reputation. It's frustrating sometimes to be a prime and not agree with the way, or to be a sub and not agree with the way the prime is approaching the contract.
We have 3 more questions that have just come in, all of them good ones. And one of the things I would suggest, again, I applaud GSA, Jeff and Melissa and everybody for doing this as a one-time thing. But I think as we're interested in schedules, we should have a continuous dialogue in some ways to look at how we can improve these things. Here's a great one. Is there a generic cheat sheet that industry is willing to share that would show what goes into considering RFI and RFP bid, no bid decisions? And who wants to volunteer up their cheat sheet?
I'd say we probably all have a similar version of, sort of a bid, no bid list, but I think, I don't want to steal the thunder of the next group, which I think is going to get into those factors far more than we should probably get into during this session.
That's a good idea, but I think if you ask the industry for that generic sheet, you all could sit down and in 5 minutes write down most of the factors, as you say, that you all consider. But let's hold that off for the next one. Here's a would this be a good idea category. Would you all like to see across all of your schedules one contract officer that would handle all of the schedules? Tom, you have a lot of them.
Depends who the contracting officer is. No, I think the answer to that, the short answer is yes. I think it would be, what I see when we're successful with our customer relationships, it's in building a relationship with that contracting officer and getting to know how they do business and how we best reflect that in the way that they do business. And I think developing relationships is really a key. So I think that would be a great thing to see.
Well, I know from the industry side, there are people who look at some of the contracting shops in GSA and contracting officers and say, oh no, we lost. I think more so what the industry is looking for is fair and consistent treatment. And I think that's very important. And I think that's where the appeals process would help there. We have another question. I think we may have already touched on this. Would focused new contractor orientation, virtual only, pre and post, be beneficial? And I think, Lynn-Ann, you talked about this, but if you'd like to talk about that more.
Yeah, I definitely think training for first-time schedule applicants would be very helpful. I know I would have taken part in that training. If that training could include meeting some of the contracting officers or hearing from some of the contracting officers to hear their different points of view would be very helpful during that training. I certainly like the idea of after an award of a renewal, or maybe even halfway through your option period of 5 years, to have some sort of, touch point or opportunity to either talk with your contracting officer or to talk, as I said before, with the marketing folks, to kind of keep that dialogue going, because every 5 years is a long period of time, especially if everything's going well. You don't have the opportunity to build as much of a relationship because everything's going well. So it would be good to do a quick training or a quick touch point.
I would suggest, as Tom was talking about the health sin, that the business has been disappointing, doing something early on after the award of that with the GSA marketing folks, with that particular customer agency or agencies, and with the industry, doing that together, so everybody learns together how it can work, would be a great idea. Yes. Melissa.
Yes. Guys, you all mentioned earlier that you wish there was some kind of appeal process if you have an issue about a SIN or something. And GSA does have a resource for that. It's not an appeal, but you can't, there is another person who's there to listen to you and try and resolve the issue that you're facing. That person is the ombudsman. Just remember that.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. We're just about out of time. Any other questions from the audience or questions that I haven't answered here? We do have one. In acquisitions over 25 million, does the project labor agreement requirement deter industry from submitting a proposal? Okay. No one knows what that is, so it's not a deterrent. There was a question about OASIS. I'm not sure that's a question for us today, but I think it was a question about 8A sole source awards, and does anybody see somebody pushing back on 8A sole source awards under OASIS? And I don't think that's for our panel. We don't even have any 8As up here, so I don't think we can help with that one. How much do you dislike LPTA? No, I made that up. So let me wrap things up here if we don't have any other questions. Any other last words from the panel?
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us here. And again, I would suggest this is the industry associations that have helped here, Krista and Bradley, and the people from industry have spent a lot of time here preparing for this. They are interested in making schedules a success, just like you all. And the more we can do it together, the more communication, joint marketing efforts, the more successful we'll be. So thanks for coming today.
Panel, thank you so very much. Really do appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a brief pause, if we will, and we'll reconvene at 10:40 a.m. with our next panel.